The chair now recognizes himself for a 5-minute opening statement. Welcome to today's hearing to look back and to take stock of the recent performance of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC. I speak for many of my colleagues when I say that this COVID-19 pandemic revealed that we did not have the CDC that we thought we had. Before I continue my remarks, I want to be clear. The COVID-19 pandemic was an immense challenge for public health agencies, healthcare providers, every level of government, and the American people. There were always going to be mistakes made, and we need to avoid the distortions of hindsight. I also believe there are many hardworking, talented doctors and public health experts working at CDC who want to do their part to keep Americans safe. One of my biggest frustrations, however, with the CDC is that when you look at all of the talent, all of the scientific knowledge, technical resources, and immense funding that we have put into the agency, the end product is somehow less than the sum of its parts. It is reasonable for the American people to expect CDC to use the best available science when preparing guidance and recommendations. All too often during the pandemic, the CDC appeared to work backwards. The agency seemed to first decide its preferred policy outcome, whether that was universal masking, vaccine mandates, shutting down businesses, or school closures. Once the policy was decided, then the agency sought out data supporting that policy decision. Data that could undermine CDC's preferred outcome was either ignored or discounted in many cases, particularly if the data came from outside of the CDC itself. As we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, the CDC's recommendations carry great weight. There's perhaps no better example of this than the process creating CDC's school reopening guidance. The damage wrought by school closures has been enormous and well documented. And fairly, I do not believe that my kids' education has recovered yet from these closures, even as we speak. The single biggest factor determining whether schools were in person or remote was the political power of public school teacher unions. At a time when parents and school systems were desperate for accurate public health guidance, the CDC allowed the group most opposed to reopening to directly edit its finalized guidance. CDC Director Dr. Walensky was even forced to state on national television that her school reopening statements many took as a CDC position that she made them, and they were given in a personal capacity, not as a CDC director. As best I can tell, this was the only time that she spoke in a personal capacity on an issue related to CDC guidance while she was agency director. In addition, when the Department of Labor issued its nationwide vaccine mandate for companies with 100 or more employees in November of 2021, it cited CDC science and guidance more than 80 times to justify the mandate. At the time the mandate was issued, there was a growing body of evidence, largely ignored by the CDC, indicating that vaccines did not stop the transmission of the disease. Thankfully, the Supreme Court struck down this mandate after only 2 months, ruling that it was unconstitutional. The CMS vaccine mandate for healthcare providers, which only ended on May 1st of this year, also relied heavily on the CDC, citing the agency over 50 times. Thousands of healthcare workers who were heralded as heroes during the early months of the pandemic lost their jobs in part because of CDC's reluctance to admit the limitations of the COVID-19 vaccines and failure to acknowledge that natural immunity can provide protection. The problems at CDC that led to the failures we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic are not new. The CDC made mistakes during its response to Ebola and Zika and other smaller localized events. What differentiates the mistakes made during COVID-19 was the scale of the emergency and the impact of those failures on the American people. It is appropriate that CDC's failures during COVID-19 prompted the agency to conduct an internal review. The first step in admitting you have a problem. This review has now led to a reorganization that appears on its face to be extensive, but there's no way for us to tell without more information from the CDC. As a part of the reorganization, CDC has asked Congress for extensive legal authorities that would require state and local governments, pharmacies, hospitals, and other healthcare providers to report to the CDC health-related information. This has huge implications for privacy and for data security. In May, this committee wrote to Director Walensky requesting information and documents related to the review and the reorganization. Congress needs this information to understand and independently assess the CDC's reorganization. Congress is constitutionally entitled to this information. We did, however, receive We did receive a 4-page letter last night that mostly reflects what is already posted on the CDC website. It was not sufficient, however, and I hope the CDC will provide the complete documentation that we have requested in our letter and that they will get that to us in short order. In closing, until we get full cooperation, the CDC's request for new legal authorities cannot and will not move forward. In today's hearing, we will hear from witnesses who will help us explore what reforms are appropriate and necessary at the CDC. And with that, I yield back